Hi, this is Julie, and welcome to Throwback Thursday. In honor of Mother's Quest turning 5, this season 7 of the podcast will bring episodes to you every Thursday. In addition to new episodes, we'll also share some powerful conversations from the archives. Keep in mind while listening that you may hear about some events or offerings that are no longer current. But whether you've heard this episode before or it's new to you, I hope you'll find something here as relevant as ever to light your way. In the wake of the reversal of Roe v. Wade, 49 years since women finally received the constitutional right to abortion, women across the country are rising up to have our voices heard. I knew this moment called for bringing back this 2017 powerful conversation with mother, filmmaker, author, and activist Paola Mendoza. This interview took place just over 5 years ago, months after the first Women's March, which Paola helped create as their artistic director, and days before the Day Without a Woman strike. As this episode reaches you, women are preparing to gather in Washington, D.C. again in another mass protest. Whether or not we go to a protest, I hope this conversation re-inspires us to get active again, participate and lead the political charge. Because, as Paola tells us, we need to remember we have the power to create the world that we want, but we all have to be engaged. Now, on to the show. Hi, and welcome to Mother's Quest, a podcast for moms like me ready to live our own truly epic life. I'm Julie Neal, a life and leadership coach, community builder, writer, and mom to 2 high-energy boys who challenge me to grow into my best self. I'll be right there. Where was I? Hello, and welcome to episode number 16 of the Mother's Quest podcast. You may be able to tell from my voice that I have another cold. This one I got from my older son. But nothing can keep me from recording this intro and bringing you this episode with a woman I deeply admire and was so honored to interview, writer, filmmaker, and activist Paola Mendoza. Before I share this week's dedication and some background about Paola, I want to invite you to press pause and take a moment to visit mothersquest.com. There you can find detailed show notes for this episode and sign up for the Facebook group to be part of that growing community. And if you've been following along this season and have been impacted by what you're hearing and learning, please use the voice message tool on the site to tell me who you are, your favorite moment from this season, and how it has supported you in living your epic life. I'm really excited to pull together your favorite moments and your reflections in your own voice to create the season finale. This week's dedication comes from a friend and a member of the Mother's Quest Founders Circle, Divya Silberman.
I'd love to give a big shout out to Julie for creating this fantastic space for all moms. Thank you, Julie. And today I'd love to dedicate this week's episode of the Mother's Quest podcast to my own mother, Christine Bhaskaran. There are so many things I admire about her, and I'd like to share 2 things that my mother taught me. The first is to give everyone the benefit of the doubt. She would always say, Divya, never assume anything or judge anyone. Try to put yourself in their shoes and their perspective. And the second is to remind yourself that everything is impermanent. She would always say, even this shall pass. The world is so full of ups and downs, and during these times, I'm reminded of her words, take stock of what you have and boldly move forward. My mother is the most resilient person I've met. She is a giver of positivity and hope. And for all of these reasons, I dedicate this episode to you, Mom. Thank you for being a superhero mom.
Thank you, Divya. I've been struck each week that even though it isn't planned, the themes shared in the weekly dedication always connect to the person who I'm interviewing. The value of putting yourself in someone else's shoes and perspective with compassion is something that this week's guest, Paola Mendoza, consciously creates through her storytelling. And the quality Divya shared about her mom boldly moving forward through difficult times is something Paola talks passionately about, as she reflects on how she moved from feelings of failure and despair after the election and rose up, channeling those emotions into a passionate co-creation of the Women's March, what became the largest worldwide gathering in history. Paola is an acclaimed actress, director, screenwriter, and author.
She was recently named one of Filmmaker Magazine 25 New Faces of Independent Film for her body of work, which includes Refinery 29, Broken Taillight, Free Like the Birds, and Z for Zendaya. She made her narrative directorial debut with the film she wrote, starred in, and co-directed, Entre Nos, which had its world premiere at Tribeca Film Festival and was awarded honorable mention. Entre Nos told the deeply personal story of Paola, her brother, and her mother's journey as immigrants to the United States from Colombia, and the challenges they experienced. It went on to win over 20 awards at film festivals from around the world, and ultimately became the novel The Ones Who Don't Stay. Paola and I talk about the impact her mother had on her, what it was like to tell her mother's story, the role of art in building compassion, and what it means to step into activism from a place of love and the things you stand for, but also for what you boldly and fearlessly stand against. We spent some time talking about moving past fear and sacrificing your privilege and teaching your children to do the same to help others, an act Paola powerfully demonstrated just 2 days after we recorded this interview when she was arrested for civil disobedience at the women's strike in New York City. Paola is a strong force, but also has a softness about her, which comes through as she talks about her relationship with her 4-year-old son, Mateo, how time with him is part of her self-care, and how they spend what they call Adventure Fridays together. I heard about her rock-solid partnership with fellow activist, entrepreneur, and storyteller Michael Skolnick, and about the epic snapshot moment Michael captured of Paola, taking in all she created as organizer and artistic director the day of the Women's March in D.C. Looking back, I'm amazed that Paola was so present and generous in our conversation, knowing what she was in the midst of organizing just days later. I could tell she did so because she wanted me and those of you who are listening now to know how important it is to take action based on our beliefs, that activism can take many shades and forms, and that with privilege comes tremendous responsibility to participate in our political system and to stand for social justice. I'm Julie Neal, and this is Mother's Quest. Paola, thank you so much for coming onto the Mother's Quest podcast today. I'm so honored to have this conversation with you, and I know you have a lot going on this week, so I promise that we'll be deep and focused, and I just know there's so much I'm going to learn from you.
Well, I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
So I'd like to start out, the first question I ask every guest on the podcast is to hear a little bit about your childhood growing up, and specifically what role your mother had in shaping who you are today.
So I'll start with the last question first before I get into the specifics of my childhood. So my mom is a central figure to who I am and the core of my being. My mother, I grew up with a single mom, so she's the only parent that I have, and that obviously makes her the person that has ingrained and raised me alongside with other family members. So my story with my mother is I was born in Bogota, Colombia. I came to the States with my mother and my brother. I was 3. My brother was 7. And my mom was a very young mother. She was, let me get this straight. She was 24 and with 2 kids. And we were coming to the States because essentially my mom realized that there wasn't a future for her or for her children in Colombia. So my father came to the States first, as most immigrant families do. The father goes first, establishes himself a little bit. My father was only here for a few months, maybe 3 or 4 months before we came. And then we arrived in LA. And a few months after our arrival in Los Angeles, my father told my mom that he had to go for a job, and he left and he never came back. And so my mom at the age of 24, which is crazy to think about now that I've long surpassed the age of 24, was left with 2 children in Los Angeles with no English, no education, a couple of $100s in her pocket, and no family because we didn't have any family here. We were the first ones from our family to come. And so my mom was able to make miracles every day. I was too young to remember that time of our lives. I only have one memory during that time in our lives, and it's actually a happy memory. But my brother, he remembers it clearly. And so the fact that she was able to not only raise us, but she was able to instill in us a sense of hope and a sense of gratitude and a sense of love for this country as well as for our family. She was also able, both my brother and I have master's degrees. So she not being educated herself was able to see that education in the United States that we wouldn't necessarily have gotten back home. And so with that, as a mother myself, and my son is 4 years old, so I'm no longer a new mother, but I still feel like a new mother every day. It's given me a whole nother appreciation for my mom, because she had two of us and she was alone under such stressful and horrible circumstances. But I don't remember my childhood being horrible, not at all. Stressful, not particularly so. Difficult, looking back at it, yes, but not in the moment. It just was what it was. And my mom was just a loving, kind person. And that's what I hope to transfer and give to my son as well.
Your mom sounds incredibly inspiring, and her story is such a powerful one given what's going on today. I also was doing some research about you and learned about a film that you made called Entre Nos. Which sounded like it was the story of your mother's experience when she came to the country when you were both young. What was it like to step into telling your mother's story in that way?
So Entre Nos was a film it was my first film that I was writing and directing, feature film. Previous to that, I had focused on documentary films as a director and predominantly as an actress. And so this idea, as a child, I was always very curious about our story. And I would ask my mom all the time about details surrounding our story. And my mom, bless her heart, was always very honest with me. She never said, no, let's not talk about that, or no, you don't understand that, or nothing. So I knew very adult aspects of our life from a very young age. And I think that was my way also of emotionally healing and dealing with my father's abandonment, was the need to know as much as I could. And so when I decided to make this movie, it was a very natural extension of who I was. It was just going more in depth with our story and my mother's story and my brother's story, and trying to understand their emotional life during that time, which was something that I had never done before, because I was obviously consumed with my own emotional life and the trauma of that time of abandonment, of a father abandoning a family and a father abandoning a child, and dealing with my own anger throughout my adolescence and early 20s. That it wasn't until I started making this movie and writing this movie that I really had to get into the shoes of my mother, get into the shoes of my brother, and then also truly understand why my father could have done what he did. And as a writer, one has to write from a place that's non-judgmental. You have to look at your characters and try and understand the decisions that they make, and try and understand their mental state when they're making these decisions. And so doing that, it was the first time in my life where I actually had to not judge my father for the horrible things that he had done.
Wow.
I actually had to look at him as a human being and realize that it wasn't that he was a horrible human being. He was just a man that was weak, and he himself was very young, and he himself was overwhelmed, and he made a very selfish decision just because he didn't have the strength to carry through what it meant to have a family as an immigrant in this country. And I actually found a lot of compassion for my father in the writing of the script, and in the making of the film. That compassion turned into forgiveness. And with that, I also was doing another film on forgiveness and really understanding what forgiveness is and how it comes and what you do with it. And I realized that because I've forgiven my father, my heart has totally forgiven my father, it doesn't necessarily mean that I want a relationship with him. I haven't seen my father. I don't have an interest in rekindling that relationship. But my heart is at ease because he was just a flawed human being. And so that's the beauty of art. And I think, again, just taking it back to where we are today, I think that during these difficult times when so many communities are being attacked, I think the role of art is to show that compassion. It's to grow compassion in people. And I think when we have compassion for other people, then we realize that Muslim bans are wrong. And we realize that building a wall on the southern border is wrong. And ripping families apart via deportation is wrong. And so that as an artist, as well as an activist, that's what I hope to be able to contribute during these very scary, difficult, crazy, unsettling times.
Yeah. Before we started recording, I was telling you a little bit about my journey, and that I've very much been thinking about story as a metaphor for my life. And I'm struck by how powerful your experience was telling your mother's story as a vehicle for your own growth, and for the things you described that are so amazing in terms of understanding your father better and finding a place of compassion and forgiveness. And for me, I've been finding the creation of this podcast and creating space for other mothers to tell their story. And then for me to be able to reflect on my own growth and learning has been just an amazing, amazing experience. So I want to get into more space for you to tell your story. I have this acronym mnemonic for EPIC, which is an EPIC is really, for me, it was this idea that someday when I'm hopefully have grandchildren, I'll be sitting with them and telling them stories about my life, and we'll be able to talk about the things that I did that really mattered, where I stepped more into love and away from fear, and have the courage to become the biggest version of myself. And I've seen this happening in you from afar about the incredible work you've been doing as a filmmaker and an activist, especially recently with everything you've done to make the Women's March possible. So I'm so excited to dig into these, what I call guideposts of an epic life with you. And the first one, E, stands for engaged mindfully with your children. And I'd love to hear a little bit more about your son and the ways in which you connect with him.
My son, he is, well, the best story of my little baby boy is when I was pregnant. I wanted, obviously, a healthy child, but I also wanted a child with red hair. It was this thing that I just desperately wanted, was a baby with red hair.
Where did that come from? That desire?
I don't know. I just always wanted a little baby with red hair. It's what I wanted. And so I had a crazy birth story. I was in labor for 57 hours, 42 hours of which were natural, 13 hours of which were on an epidural in the hospital. And then the last 10 minutes were an emergency C-section. So it was bananas.
Yeah.
And in the C-section, Michael, my partner, they took the baby out and they went and put him wherever they needed to put him. And so Michael goes to see him and he screams across the operating room, "He has red hair." So I got my baby with red hair, and he's kind and compassionate and very funny and is full of energy and calls himself a real ninja.
Oh, I love that.
So we connect over being ninjas, even though we're a very peaceful household. He loves weapons and knives and swords, and we do not have, he's not allowed to play with guns. So he knows that, and we've explained why to him. So so honestly, we connect over the things that are of interest to him. I really try and focus on letting him be who he wants to be and supporting him as much as possible. He loves adventure. So I have tried to not let my fear of him getting hurt stifle his desire to be adventurous and jump off of things and do crazy things. And I also myself am someone that has always loved adventure and has always loved to do things. I'm not one that sits in my house ever. So what we had up until this year when he got to preschool is we had Adventure Fridays. And that was really our day where I would take Fridays off from work, and he and I would go have adventures throughout the city. And I speak to him in Spanish. And so he would wake up every morning and say, Mama, is today aventura? And so when we would finally get to our Adventure Fridays, he was very, very excited about our Adventure Fridays. So that's really how we've connected.
I absolutely love that. I have a 4.5-year-old little guy who's also full of energy and would love to have Adventure Fridays. So I'm going to be scheduling that now. I just love that idea. And
really
on a previous podcast, I interviewed our pediatrician, Dr. Lisa Song, who I adore. And she talked about this concept of special time, which I've been doing, really consciously setting aside time each day if you can, where you're not only really focused and present, but you're really following the lead of your child and letting them determine what you're going to do together. So I love this idea of Adventure Friday as a longer and even more special extension of that I've already been practicing. What's been one of his most favorite Adventure Fridays with you?
So he loves Coney Island. So in the summertime, we go to Coney Island. He adores it. But also one of the best was there was this pop-up live museum in Lower Manhattan. And so it was just the sensory museum where they had like 10 different rooms, and they had various lights and lasers and smoke and colors. It was just an extraordinary event. And so I had heard of it, and I saw the pictures about it on Instagram. So I was like, oh, I'm taking him. And we had to wait outside, and it was free for an hour in the cold in New York City. But when we got inside, he just loved it. They had to kick us out of the actual museum because we were taking him too much time. So that was a really, really great one as well.
Amazing. Well, let's move on to the next guidepost, which is P, and it stands for passionate and purposeful. And this is about making a difference beyond your family. I'd love to hear the way that you define the difference that you're trying to make in the world. You already mentioned, part of your role is helping people be more compassionate and understand one another better. What else these days is your focus?
So to talk about my focus today, I feel like I have to go back a little bit, and that is to the election. Both my partner and I, Michael Skolnick, were very involved in trying to get Hillary Clinton elected president. And we went canvassing with Mateo. We went to 3 different states, took him with us with his stroller, pushed him when he was awake, when he was asleep. He handed out stickers. He would say, yay, Hillary Clinton, boo, Donald Trump. And then he would say, don't boo, vote. That was his thing.
That's his thing.
And we did a lot of PSAs for Hillary. And so when Hillary lost, Michael and I were at the Javits Center for Hillary's win. And when she lost, when we finally realized that she accepted the fact that she was losing, we left at 1 a.m. in the morning from the Javits Center. I came home, and the first thing that I did was I went into my son's bedroom. I kissed him on the forehead, and I said I was sorry. I said I was sorry because we tried really, really hard. All of us did, but we failed. And we failed by not giving children the future that I strongly think that they deserve. Instead, we've given them a future that is filled with a lot of fear, a lot of injustice, a lot of decimation of our planet, a lot of instability. And we did that. And I feel that we all have to take responsibility for the choices that we've made as a country. And I know that I will be okay. I have a very privileged life. I live in New York City. I have a strong foundation of who I am and how I see this world. But I worry for the children who are now growing up in a Trump presidency and how that affects their foundation for the vision of the world that they're living in. So after the election, I was quite devastated. I gave myself one day to cry and be upset and feel lost and feel like the world was caving in on us. And I had a lot of conversations with a lot of people that were very afraid for their lives, literally for their lives, because they're immigrants. And then those conversations kind of shook me out of my depression. And I realized that I didn't have the privilege to just sit on my couch and cry, that I actually had to do something. Because in the doing of nothing was when I would actually fail. I would fail for the long term. So the first 3 days were spent calling every filmmaker that I knew and having conversations with them around this idea of the role of art during this time. And what were we going to do? And how does this change the work that we were making? And how does it change our future for the next 4 years? And really strategizing around cultural work. And I called people that I knew very, very well and people that I had hardly a relationship with. I was fearless. I just didn't care. I called executives, I called agents, I called producers, I called writers, I called directors. Some of those conversations were 10 minutes long, and some of them were an hour and a half long. And it was really about peeling people off the floor and saying, you have to get to work. Like, there is nothing else to do but to get to work. And within that, it felt very healing. I found strength in that. And so then I heard that a friend of mine, Carmen Perez, was working on the Women's March. Because the Women's March had just started taking off virally. And so I reached out to her and I told her that I wanted to get involved, and we had a phone call, and then she brought me on to help her with partnerships. And that was week 2. And it was a very small group at that point. And partnerships led to she and I working side by side and getting over 530 partners on board for the Women's March. It was nonstop phone calls with organizations and people trying to literally convince them why this Women's March was happening, why it was important, what we were doing, what the plan was, putting people at ease that it was going to be safe and important, and that it was happening regardless of anything else. And then within that, I also became the artistic director for the Women's March. And so dealt with all of the storytelling aspects of it, but the storytelling aspects being like, what was the story we were trying to tell, with the program, with the speakers, with the artwork that we chose, with the partnerships that we managed around artists, with the artist table. And then the day of, which I wasn't planning on doing, but I mean, I don't know why I thought I wasn't going to do this. I was dreaming that someone else would do it for me, but I then ran this show the day of, which was bananas and crazy. And then it's just the most stressful thing I've ever done. And so since then, I find myself living in 2 worlds. And I have to say that I had never been an organizer before the Women's March. In my work is very political. And so I always felt that my organizing was through my art. And so I didn't actually organize on the front lines, because I thought that, and I still believe that my art was doing that social political work for me in a different way. Yeah. And you need both. You need the frontline activists, and then you need the culture work, and then you need the policymakers, and then you need the people in order to make change. So my day job now is, one foot is in this idea of working as an artist, of writing and pushing the stories forward that I feel are important to be telling at this time, and how those stories will make a difference. And then my other foot is still in the organizing day-to-day for the Women's March. We have an action coming up on Wednesday, which is the general strike, A Day Without a Woman. So organizing around that. And seeing, what the future holds for us in 2018 and 2020. Really embracing that we are the resistance, that I am the resistance. And this household is very much so, in many ways, one of the many hearts of the resistance. And so constantly having dinners and meetings with people that are strategizing around how the resistance will win in 2018, 2020, and beyond.
Oh my goodness. I have so many questions I want to ask you about all of this. Because of time, I want to ask you a question that I'm hoping will help me and guide me as I move more into my own activism. I read an article where you talked about that the Women's March was not an anti-Trump march, that it was really standing for the ideals you believe in. And that resonated with me a lot. And I wrote a blog post about how when I went to the Women's March, which I went to in Oakland, and was incredibly powerful and so positive. It was so moving to be a part of that. I really went with the words that my 4-year-old had reflected back to me about us focusing on our goodness. And that has really been a guide for me, because the act of resistance or being against something, it feels very out of my nature, which is not to say that I don't need to build my muscle around, stepping into resistance. But I've had to figure out that if I'm going to become more active, and I feel 100% compelled to do so, that I need to do it in a way that feels aligned with who I am. Could you share a little bit about your perspective around activism? What made you share in that article your value around the march being for the things that matter? And if you have any words of wisdom for me as I'm moving into this new realm that feels sometimes uncomfortable.
The Women's March released a Points of Unity document, which is on our website. So if any of your listeners want to go check it out, it's
I can link
womensmarch.com. And that Points of Unity document is really beautiful, about 2 pages, 3 pages of how we see the world. It's all about the things that we are for, how we see immigration, how we see religious inclusion, how we see reproductive rights and reproductive justice, and how we see climate justice. It's not about him or what we are against. Exactly as you say, it's about what we're for. And when that Points of Unity document was released, it was really looked at and claimed as a turning point in the movement to the left, because it was intersectional, it was inclusive, and it was all about what we are for. And I think that that's where we on the left that are part of the resistance are not just reacting and fighting against, but we are also proposing not just policy, but solutions, that we are solution-based. Now, that being said, and this goes back to your idea of being uncomfortable with being against certain things, there are certain things that one just has to come out against. It is more abhorrent if you stay silent on a Muslim ban than if you come out and say, I am completely against this. We need citizens. We need people that are afraid and uncomfortable to be brave, because you are not the only one that is afraid and uncomfortable. There are 11.3 million families in this country that are afraid that their families are going to be ripped apart, and that fear is real and palpable. Yeah. There are millions of Muslims in this country that are afraid that they might just disappear one day because the government says that they don't want Muslims in here. There might be internment camps. So we are all afraid, and this is our moment in our history where we figure out what we do with that fear. And it's okay to be afraid. What is not okay is to let that fear or that uncomfortability guide you.
Stop you. Yeah. This is a great transition into the next guidepost, which is I invested in yourself, because the natural question that came for me next was wanting to hear more from you, especially because you are on the front lines in such a major way, and your partner, Michael, too. How do you take care of yourself and sustain yourself in managing the fear, and also, managing how much this work that you're doing is taking from you? I mean, you mentioned that you're often up till 4 a.m. in the morning. How are you also caring for yourself as you move through this?
Self-care, Audre Lorde, essentially she said that self-care was an act of political warfare, in that when we take care of ourselves, we are allowing ourselves, we're saying that we are important enough to take care of ourselves, that our voices matter enough, our body matters enough, our ideas matter enough, that they need to be protected, and they need to be ready for what is inevitably going to be a long, long road. We have seen and heard that quote so often, that this is not a race, this is not a sprint, this is a marathon. Yeah. And I've amended it to say, actually, it's a relay. Because we we cannot do this alone. And so my self-care is really my son, in the sense that when I come home and I play with my son, that is my joyous time. That is my time where it doesn't matter what Donald Trump has said that morning or that evening or what executive order has been signed, that the time that I have with my son when we're playing at home together is just for him and I. And so that's my daily self-care that I need to do for me, but I also need to do for him. And then my ritualistic self-care, my self-care larger than that, we did just go on a vacation, which was so needed. And I basically slept every night. I fell asleep at 8:30. And that was very much needed, but it was a hard thing to do, to get away, and unplugging was not possible. And I eat very well. So I'm a very healthy eater again. So I guess what I'm saying is that I try to incorporate my self-care into my daily acts of living, because I don't have time for massages. I don't have time to get a pedicure or a manicure. I don't have time to get a facial. I don't have time to go on retreats. And it's mainly that if I wanted to have time, I would make the time. But at this moment in time, I feel too guilty to be able to do that. I can't go and get a facial just for fun when my friends are being hurt. And so, and that's just my personal reality. And then I also have great friends that are also, all of them are involved in this. So there's just great joy when we're together. I had some friends over last night on Friday, and we basically laughed for 3 hours. So those are memories.
So powerful.
Yeah.
I looked up the quote that you were mentioning from Audre Lorde, and it's, "Caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare."
Exactly.
Really powerful. You naturally led us to the next guidepost, which is C, connected to a strong support network, as you started talking about your friends and the power of laughter. But there's one more thing I wanted to ask you about before we move off of the invested in yourself, about the fear, because I'm curious, and maybe you don't feel it as often, but I have the sense that there must be times where you are fearful about being so out front in your activism. I guess what is your relationship with fear? Maybe it's not as present as I'm imagining, and how do you move through that?
There is absolutely fear for our safety. There have been times when there's been death threats against us, and Michael's had to have personal security.
Wow.
And so and I think now even more so that fear is even more palpable, because Donald Trump has unleashed this idea that hurting certain people is justifiable. And so that makes for a country that is more violent, as we've seen that. We've seen hate crimes rise. We've seen people be murdered because they thought they were immigrants. We've seen all kinds of horrific things. So that is a real fear. I also, my country, I come from Colombia, and Colombia was a country at war for 52 years. And it was also a very dangerous place for human rights activists. It still is one of the most dangerous places for human rights activists in the world.
Wow.
So that idea of violence being around because of the work that you do is a very real thing, but we don't spend much time thinking about it in our everyday. We do things to protect ourselves and protect our family. But for me, that is what this moment in time requires. Yeah. I cannot live with myself personally by sitting back and being quiet when my friends and my family are being attacked and hurt. I live in a very nice apartment in New York City. I'm very privileged. I know that. But I wasn't always. I was homeless when we first got to the United States. I've lived on the streets with my mom. And so the fact that I've been able to then rise up so high, literally, I don't feel at all guilty about that, but I do know that with that privilege comes a huge responsibility.
Yeah.
And my son will be more privileged than I could have ever imagined. And so for me, it's extremely important for him to be of such privilege and to be a child of immigrants. But ultimately, when he walks down the street, he looks like a white man. He has red hair and white skin, and he will have the privilege of what it means to be a white man in this country. And so I will have failed in my life if my son is not willing to sacrifice his privilege for the benefit to help other people. And I feel that to my core. And so, you know, when he knows that his mom's an immigrant and he says, Mama, am I an immigrant? And I say, no, you're not an immigrant. He says, why, Mama? I want to be an immigrant. And like, that's where we as a country should be. Like, that's how celebratory we should be of others. So yeah, there's just the fears there, but it doesn't control us. And we take actions around that. And we also know what we're getting into is all I can say.
Thank you for sharing that. I was moved to tears during parts of what you were saying about just, you know, the responsibility that comes with the privilege that I have too, and the deep desire, because I'm raising two boys who, you know, are incredibly privileged, and wanting to find my way to step up to be the best mother I can be, to really teach them about how to use the gifts that they have in their life, to be a champion for other people.
Yes.
So I look forward to continuing to learn from you on that front, Paola. The C in EPIC stands for connected to a strong support network. And the idea there is that you're in community on your journey. Tell me a little bit more about the ways in which you have found connection to support you.
I think that my community is made up of artists. My community of fellow artists are incredible. And they range in success, like front-facing success, to the most famous, to the least famous, to the most talented, to the questionably talented. And, you know, there is great beauty in knowing that I can call them and ask them about art, ask them about work, but then also have them be there for me personally. And I invest in those friendships and in those work relationships, and I invest in them because they make me better. And I think that my closest friends would say that, you know, I am reliable to them, and they are reliable to me because we just deeply love one another. The Women's March community is another extraordinary community that we did something. A small group of us did something historic that no one in our life will probably ever have a moment like that again.
Yeah.
That will never be replicated in our lifetime, I think. And so the people that you create that with, you will always have a shorthand with them. And again, we laughed so much together, and we enjoyed the craziness of it all together. And there's just no words to describe like what we lived through before, the day of, and even now, even the after, where we are in the aftermath, and the tears that were shed, of both joy and heartbreak and fear and stress. So, and then of course my community is my family, is Michael and my son. Michael and I, my partner and I, have been together for 17 years. We got together very, very young, and we grew up together. I became a woman with him, and he became a man with me. And our lives are very individualized, but they are also inextricably bound to one another, particularly because we have a son together now. And so he is my rock. He is who I can be the most vulnerable with, and who I can be the most angry with, and who I can be insecure with, and who I can be silly with. And so I think that that's what's crucial is the community that you have. And then I have my mom, who worries for me, but also went to the march in Los Angeles. It was her first march ever, and she was so inspired and loved it so much. So I have a great community, and I'm very lucky to be able to lean on them when I need to.
So I know Michael as well. We've been connected through my dear friend Rachel Winter, and I worked for years at Alternatives in Action, and Alex Morrison, who is Michael's cousin,
yes,
board of directors, and Alex and I were close partners in raising money for the organization. And so I know just what a amazing person he is too. And one of the things I've noticed, through seeing his posts on Facebook, is what an incredible champion he is for you. And how honest and vulnerable he is about that. And something that is really standing out for me is this photo he posted of you towards the end of the performance at the Women's March in D.C. And just this look of awe that you had. I'm imagining you were looking up at the stage, and he just talked about what it was like to witness your sacrifice and your dedication as you were creating this thing that I think, you didn't even have any idea what it would grow into. What was it like for you in that moment? I talk about snapshots of an epic life as something I'm really curious about when I interview people for the podcast. I'm imagining that may have been one of an epic moment snapshots for you, and I'm curious what was going on in your mind behind that photo.
So, because I was running the show the rally, the show the day of, and it was backstage was insane with just the amount of people that were back there. It was very, very crowded, as well as the people that were back there was also crazy. Like, I would be running by and I would see Cher, and I would run by and I would see Madonna, and I would run by and I would see, I don't even know, Zendaya. And like, it was just like insane to be in that moment. But then also just the amount of, and then the amounts of people that were just around us and about us, and it was the sea of pink hats. But it was all very much on the running of the show was very much on my shoulders, and so I didn't have a moment once the show started. I didn't have a moment to enjoy anything because I was focused on getting the job done.
Yeah,
and so in that last, the show was like 4 hours long. It was really long. And so for 4 hours, I was dealing with every problem you could imagine, on top of like making sure the show was running smoothly. And so in that moment that Michael captured, was when Madonna was performing, actually. And Madonna was what Madonna was. She was not the person that I was most excited to see that day, but that was just the moment in which it happened, where I just sat down for a moment and said, you just have to enjoy this. Like, take this moment in, because you will never have this moment again in your life. And I was literally 5 feet from Madonna. And I was like, that's crazy, because that's the first tape I ever owned in my life. And here I am 5 feet away from her, literally. And out there is millions of people. And I am here at the center of this. So it was just a moment of deep appreciation, of being conscious in that moment of what we had all done. And also, and I think this is really important, and something like positive to end on, that we all, like I mentioned before, November 8th, the day of the election, the day after, we all failed, in the sense that there was failure. We all had failed, and we had fallen down flat on our faces. We were all beyond, failure is painful anyways, but this was, I feel for me personally, a different kind of pain, a different kind of heartbreak.
Because the stakes were so high.
Yeah. And then 10 weeks later, we all rose up. We got back up. And like, that's what it's about. It's not about the failure. It's about how you rise up from the failure.
Yeah.
And we all rose up in beautiful, compassionate, intelligent, celebratory, fighting spirit kinds of ways. And like, so that was the moment of like, wow, like we rose up and we are not beat. We have not been beaten. We fell, but we are back up and now we are running. And so that, I think, is what that moment was for me.
So powerful. And as you're talking, I'm just thinking of the fact that, that moment was a moment of, we rose up. And I say we because I was out there too.
Mm-hmm.
It was also my first time ever attending a march. And I know there's so many other women like me that this has created an opening to step into a different part of ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
But what's clear is that we're still rising up.
Mm-hmm.
It's a process that I feel like that day began and it's continuing.
And I would encourage all of the women, yourself included, and all of your listeners that had never participated or who had never participated in March or hadn't participated in 20, 30 years, which I heard a lot about that too, that we need you. We need your voices. And being an activist comes in various colors and shapes and forms and different levels of participation. But what we need, what this country needs is participation. And women, and that's what Wednesday's general strike is all about, is that women have power, and that we need women to be leading the political charge. And as we can see with the Women's March, the world will listen when women are leading. Yeah. It was the largest gathering of people all across the world. That's insane.
Ever.
5 million people. Numbers range from 5 million to 6 million people around the world for one event. So that women did that. And that's what we have to continue to remember, that we have the power to create the world that we want, but we all have to be engaged.
Well, so Paola, that brings us into the part of the interview where I get to ask you what challenge, a specific challenge or invitation that you have for me and others who want to say yes to the challenge as well. I feel like you just laid out a powerful mantra and perspective about just actively participating. Is there anything else you want to offer in the way of either resources or a specific action?
I would say this with regards to specificity. Find out what issue do you care about, and what issue that's the important thing. Starting from a place that you care about.
Yeah.
And with that issue that you care about, find a local organization that works in that issue. Call them up. See what they need. They need volunteers. They might need help with XYZ. They might need help with fundraising. You don't know what they need. So find out what they need and go and do that. Volunteer. Give 3 hours of your week towards an issue that you care about.
Yeah.
And that is a specific action. If you need help finding organizations, you can go on our website. We have over 540 partners that are listed on our website that you can see if they're local or if they're national, if they have a local office like that. That's what we need. And then the second challenge, because I'm going to give you 2 challenges, is when there's congressional recesses, see where the town halls are happening in your area and go and attend those town halls, because the town halls, as we saw with the last congressional recess, is where change and pressure is actually happening. And all you got to do is show up and tell your congresswoman or your congressman what you care about.
Okay, I absolutely accept both of those challenges. I'm active in a lot of the issues that I care about already, and I think that around this idea of more political activism, it can feel overwhelming. There are so many different, bills and repeals and things that are happening. So I'm going to do some real introspection and figure out, not that I can't take action on more than one, but what's the one that I really want to commit myself to and go deeper and then get local with the impact of that. I really appreciate that. And then absolutely, I've never been to a town hall either. So I say yes to that. And what's the best way to find out when that is? Just get in touch with my Congress.
You can go to indivisible.com, or you can go, indivisible.com normally lists the town halls.
Great. Okay, I accept your challenge. Thank you. Well, especially knowing that you have this Day Without a Woman coming up in just 2 days from the time that we're recording this, I am so grateful to have this time with you. I know it will have an impact, continued impact in my life and for those who are listening. And I just want to share a few things that are really landing with me from what you shared, gifts that you're giving me as I continue on my epic life. One is the power of art and story as a form of social and political work. I was really struck by that powerful quote that you shared from Audre Lorde about self-care as a form of political warfare. And I love thinking about the adventures that you're having with your son and creating more space for that, and how being present and creating that important time with our children is a form of self-care and is a way to sustain us and the important work that we all have to do right now. Thank you.
Definitely. Thank you.
What are some of the biggest takeaways that you're leaving this conversation with?
Just that it's important to share our stories, whatever those stories may be. Kind of what I live my artistic life on. The sharing of stories creates compassion. Compassionate storytelling is where so much can get fixed.
Yeah. Well, thank you again for telling your story today.
Thank you.
Good luck this week.
Thanks.
I'll be participating.
Great. Love it.
Here.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Take care, Julie. Bye.
Thank you so much for coming along with me on this episode of the Mother's Quest podcast. I hope this conversation sparked something that will help you live your epic life. If you'd like to get show notes and learn more about how to join the Mother's Quest community, head over to mothersquest.com. And while you're there, I would love it if you would follow the prompts to subscribe, leave a review on iTunes, and help us spread the word. I want to end with some words to light the way on your quest. Seize the day, love your people, honor your gifts. Until next time.